I thought to start with an apology to Benj, because on this day of his simcha, of his great joy, and all of ours, we have to talk about matters of grave importance because of the tragedies that unfolded over the course of the past week. But I realized that really this apology is not in order, because this is part of becoming bar mitzvah, is placing yourself in the heart of Jewish community and being a part of life and death and all that comes with it. And so I transition us now to a kind of different headspace, all with the awareness that we hold it all with one heart. A person is found dead in the land, and nobody knows exactly who killed him. Deuteronomy 21, verse 1. Who is responsible? Because someone surely is responsible. So the elders and the judges of all of the neighboring towns the Torah prescribes, it is they who step forward, and they measure the distance from their cities to the deceased. And then the elders of the city that is nearest to the body bring out a heifer, an eglah arufah, and they break its neck in the place of that dead body. Then they wash their hands over that animal, and they say the following words: "Our hands have not shed this blood." And only then are they freed of the responsibility for the killing of that person. This is a strange and confounding passage, one that has prompted centuries of commentary and speculation. Blood on their hands? How could we imagine that they, the leaders of the neighboring towns, were in any way culpable for this murder? Is it just by virtue of proximity? I have been consumed by questions of culpability and responsibility this past year, and even more so this past week. In one searing image, one of many that I will never unsee, a group of bereaved women surround the body of 24-year-old Eden Yerushalmi, executed by Hamas only days before. Eden is wrapped in her burial shroud and about to be lowered into the earth. The women are wailing, and one of them holds a sign that says simply, "Slicha, Eden." Eden, I am so sorry. That was a sentiment that we heard echoed across the internet and at so many of the funerals this past week, as the 6 hostages whose bodies were found in a tunnel beneath Rafah were laid to rest, surrounded by family and friends, and broken-hearted loved ones, and a shattered nation. Listen to the words of John and Rachel, Hirsch's parents, these two who carried on their anguished shoulders the weight of the world, who humanized their son and our people, and who showed us, like the moral leaders we so desperately need in our time, what it means to hold both grief and empathy in one heart. "We failed you," John said to his son, "but you would not have failed you." And then Rachel said, "If there was something we could have done to save you and we didn't think of it, I beg your forgiveness. We tried so very hard, so deeply and desperately. I'm sorry." Both of them with these words echoing their son that terrible morning, now 1 full year ago nearly. "I love you," he wrote. "I'm sorry." And you know, even from within my grief and my anguish this week, I can't help but nearly boil over with rage. Rage because Eden's family did not fail her, and Rachel and John did not fail Hirsch. No, they and so many of the families of the Chatufim, of these hostages, have spent every waking moment for the past year fighting with superhuman powers to shift the course of history, to save their loved ones from the terrible and avoidable fate that 6 of them met last week. They, it is clear to me, are most certainly not the people who need to offer an apology today. 6 people are found dead in the land, and nobody knows exactly who killed them. Who then is responsible? The elders and the judges are called forth. Where were you? What could you have done to save these lives? Now, maybe it's not quite as confounding this year to understand why the leaders of the community are held responsible in the biblical and rabbinic imagination. But the rabbis want to be certain that we understand exactly where the responsibility lies and why. And so in the Talmud, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi asserts, Ein egla arufa ba, ela bishvil tsarei ha'ayin. These deaths occurred, and the need for this ritual with the heifer occurred only because of the miserliness and the stinginess of spirit that became embedded in the culture. How easily in this place were some lives determined to be of ultimate importance while others were rendered completely meaningless. Now, how does such a miserliness embed in a population? When it is embodied by that population's leadership. And so the elders and the judges, those who failed to model moral responsibility, are now forced to admit, had we been fully attentive to their humanity, these people would still be alive. The assumption here is that the leaders of a society that fails to see and protect and support even the stranger among them, let alone their own, are responsible for the spilling of their blood. That is a powerful warning to the people here in the book of Deuteronomy as they prepare to cross over and then to build their own society in Canaan. And it is a critical mandate for those who have the chutzpah to believe that they can build their own state or political entity. There is a cost to sovereignty, and that cost is radical accountability, the eternal responsibility to go to the ends of the earth to protect and care for your people. For every single one of them is an image of God. And so there stood President Herzog, who, yes, in his sorrow in the earliest days of the war, grasped onto the desperate and dangerous rhetoric of revenge, but who ever since has spent the last year trying desperately to provide comfort and calm and rationality in the midst of the horrific unfolding tragedies of war. Listen to Herzog's model of public tshuva, a rare, genuine apology from a leader to the people. Beloved Hirsch, he said, with a torn and broken heart, I stand here today as the president of the state of Israel, bidding you farewell and asking for your forgiveness from you and Carmel, from Eden and Almog and Alex and Ori, and from all of your loved ones. I apologize on behalf of the state of Israel because we failed to protect you in the terrible disaster of October 7th, and we failed to bring you home safely. This apology, I believe, will be marked as one of the most important speeches a public official in Israel has given in Israel's history. And yet, the president's sincere presence only makes more painful the stunning absence of accountability among his fellow leaders. There is a wild story that's told in the Talmud in Tractate Yoma that challenges our sense of the bounds of accountability. I have brought this story many times before as I have tried to grapple with the question of who ultimately is responsible, and I believe we would do well to wrestle with it now. The setting is Jerusalem some 2,000 years ago. 2 young, overeager priests, Kohanim, are preparing to bring a sacrifice to the altar at the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. A giant crowd surrounds them to bear witness to this holy act in this holy site. What starts off as a ceremonial procession quickly turns into a raging competition that ends when one of those Kohanim, one of those priests, takes out his knife intended for the sacrificial offering and drives it through his colleague's back, right into his heart. The first Kohen falls to the ground, and the whole crowd stares in a hushed silence. And then a great sage named Rabbi Tzadok arises and cries out on that day, "Brothers, house of Israel, listen to me. Don't you remember the Eglah Arufah, the broken-necked heifer that we read today from the book of Deuteronomy? The Torah teaches that when a person is killed, it is imperative that we ask the question, who here is truly responsible? So what about now? Who is responsible for the murder that we all just witnessed with our own eyes? Remember, they all just saw what unfolded. They know exactly who held the knife. But in a just society, in a compassionate society, it is never just the person holding the knife who is responsible. No, here we must will ourselves to see the larger and much more damning story. And so Rabbi Tzadok asks, is it only the Kohanim, the priests, who are responsible? Or perhaps it's all of us, all of the residents of Jerusalem. And when the people, the residents of Jerusalem, hear this, they burst into tears. They cry because they know that Rabbi Tzadok is right. Were it not for the vulgar, violent, obsessive culture that had grown normative in their time, that priest would never have thought to take out his knife and harm another person. And so every one of them must ask themselves, what have I done to support and encourage a culture of violence and extremism? Rabbi Tzadok needs the people to understand, you don't have to be the one holding the knife to share responsibility for its harm. The people cry because they recognize for a moment that violence generally does not happen in a vacuum. That as Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of a human being. That in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. The story goes on. Just as the people begin to grapple with the vastness of this criminal act and their potential complicity, the father of the dying priest, this boy writhing in pain, runs up the ramp to check on his son, and then unthinkably grabs the knife out of his son's back and holds it up to the crowd. Behold, he says, my son will be an atonement for you, even though he is dying. This knife has not yet become tameh, ritually impure. Back to business as usual, folks. There's nothing to see here. It's almost too much to bear. This comes to teach us, the Talmud reports, that they prioritize the ritual purity of their utensils even more than the spilling of blood. I told you this story has haunted me for more than a decade. It is a harsh polemic against Temple Judaism and what the rabbis saw as the moral failure of the priests, the religious leadership, so punctilious in ritual and so profoundly ethically compromised. Not at all unlike some of the leading rabbis in Israel today, so caught up in their messianic fantasy that they write rabbinic responsa, explicitly undermining age-old Torah precepts, prioritizing pidyon shvuyim, the rescue of hostages, and pikuach nefesh, the saving of human life above all else. This story so powerfully reveals the instincts to quickly pivot from any real reckoning. God forbid we should consider all that has been lost and affirm the moral necessity to shift course. How hungrily the crowd must have embraced that Kohen's father's permission to look away, like some of our political leadership does today. You're off the hook. We are off the hook. No need to think too deeply here. Let's get back to our regularly scheduled war. Yachad linatseach, together to victory. But we must not look away, friends. What we are confronting today in the painful aftermath of the massacre of these 6 innocents is a widespread systems failure. The responsibility for these murders clearly rests on Hamas, a deranged enemy that manipulated a just cause, the need for a just future for the Palestinian people, for their dignity and their self-determination. They manipulated that into a perverse and sadistic death cult that giddily abducts and rapes and massacres innocents and then hides and executes hostages in tunnels beneath daycare centers. A depraved force committed to maximizing both physical and psychic injury. It is also the failure of every person who cosplays as a righteous revolutionary while justifying, excusing, and amplifying violent and inhumane behavior. This is true in both camps. Those on campus and in social media adding violent fuel to this fire, and those propagating the lie that atrocities can be the foundation of a future just society. It's just not so. As if you can achieve the liberation of one people through the annihilation of another. As if we are not all one. But the ancients will not even let us stop here. No, they insist that we look even more deeply, that we consider the full scope of the complicity and accountability here, and that is precisely what's happening on the streets in Israel this past week. Now, some American religious leaders will righteously insist that now is not the time to speak out, but rather just to grieve. And yet 700,000 Israelis, the equivalent of more than 30 million Americans, are taking their grief to the street. They are led by families of the remaining hostages and some of the released hostages themselves. And they insist that time has run out. They are demanding an end to this terrible war. They are demanding a hostage deal that brings everyone home. They want peace now. Listen to Nurit, Almog's mother. Enough, she said, enough. We paid the ultimate price. I only pray that we are the last. Like Rabbi Tzadok, they are standing before the nation and they are demanding accountability. They insist that this government, which continues to recklessly and stubbornly and repeatedly move the goalposts on a deal, is actually responsible for the murders of our hostages. Young people full of life who should be home now, safely recovering and healing. These Israelis stand before the Netanyahu regime saying what, after 11 months of hell on both sides of that fence, should be eminently clear. The prime minister must resign. You who have chosen the path of war at all costs, not only the cost to the Palestinian innocents to whom you are willfully indifferent, but even the cost to our beloved innocents. Must the people continue to suffer for your callous intransigence and cynical political calculations? These are not the enemies of the state. These are people draped in the Israeli flag, people who have paid their ultimate price for this state. They have lost faith in a leader who has weakened their state, who has poisoned their culture, who has cynically torn apart the social fabric, manipulating people's fears and hiding again and again from responsibility for the gross failures of October 7th, for the horrors of this war, for the mandate to prioritize bringing home our hostages alive. A leader who has stubbornly ignored the pleading not only of the hostage families, but of the heads of his own security and intelligence services too, as if he alone knows better. The people need and the people deserve a better leader than this corrupt political operator, an expert only in selling lies. They need accountability. They need empathy. They need moral imagination. We need accountability and empathy and moral imagination. Someone who will help us grieve and then dream and ultimately realize a just and thriving future in that land, a peaceful future. The murder of these 6 hostages last week, after all that they had suffered through and survived, felt to many of us like October 7th all over again. The death of Hirsch felt like the death of hope. This was a shocking and horrifying naked pain, a pain that pierces all illusions and forces us to confront the brutal and unforgiving truth that they could have lived, that their own government let them die. The ritual of the Rafah, which we read in today's parasha, was taught to our ancestors thousands of years ago to ensure that they would remember. Building the promised land demands more than building just any nation state. It demands that we build a society that honors the foundational principle that every single human being created in God's own image is precious, and that the death of even one innocent is a moral catastrophe. This week, my friend Sarah Tuttle Singer gave voice to some of the pain of this moment, sharing the image of Hirsch back in his neighborhood in Jerusalem, up on a ladder where she imagines him, taking down the banner with his face on it himself, and then hugging his friends with one arm, thanking them for keeping the light on for him, and for always believing that he would return just like his parents did. How we prayed and hoped that this would be. Hirsch, Carmel, Alex, Eden, Ori, and Almog were loved deeply in this world. Their deaths will leave a gaping hole. Rachel, we share your prayer that their deaths will be a turning point in this horrible situation in which we are all entangled. Please, God, let it be so. Yehi zichronam ma'apecha. May their memories be a revolution. Shabbat shalom.